It's funny. I keep in contact with many of my previous students who have gone on to medical school, nursing school, PA programs, all sorts of different clinicians, different specialties. And one of the things that they said always amazed them was the sheer number of cases of diarrhea or upset stomach they actually had to see, you know, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So, from a clinical standpoint, when you're discussing diarrhea, you're going to be looking at it as a short term issue, fast onset, lots of it going on, or has this been a long term problem? Acute versus chronic. Patient presents, they're saying, oh, I've had diarrhea 3 or 4 times, 5 times in the past, so far just this day, today. Well, that's classic acute diarrhea. Because when it comes down to it, I mean, every person in the U.S. is going to end up with diarrhea, acute diarrhea, from one of, you know, the different infections that we're going to be talking about in this section of the chapter. 1 to 2 cases per year for every person here in the United States. That's 3 to 700 million instances of somebody coming down with acute diarrhea per year. Yes, for those of you who are going to be planning on a clinical future, you're going to be seeing this. Turns out kids are going to experience it more often than adults, which makes sense. Younger children, their hygiene's not going to be quite what it needs to be, and they're going to have a, you know, tendency to just shove whatever into their mouth. Whereas the older you get, well, you know what? Yeah, that doesn't smell quite right. I don't like the way that looks. I'm just going to go buy another one. Okay? Kids don't think that way. Now, so far, those numbers I was just tossing out, the hundreds of millions, that was here in the US, okay? We're, an industrial first world country. You go to developing countries, you're going to see those numbers are going to go way up. Instead of 1 to 2 cases per person, you're going to be looking at 10 plus. Water source comes in direct contact with their sewage, or they don't have a sewer system. Their water source is also their sewer, their way of getting rid of wastes. So they're constantly drinking or eating food that was prepared with fecally contaminated water. Some areas of the world, acute diarrhea is one of the early childhood diseases. Can the child survive coming into contact, drinking water that everybody else has to eat or drink? The issue when it comes to acute diarrhea in young children is the loss of nutrients, the loss of stored nutrients. Because think about it, diarrhea is basically your large intestine, instead of absorbing water, is now pumping water out. And unfortunately, with that water goes any stored nutrients you may have. You're going to be depleting nutrients, you're going to be depleting all the different minerals and salts. You do that repetitively over and over enough times, especially in early childhood, you're going to have an impact on development, physical development, mental development, and there will be repercussions later in life. Here in the US, it's going to be contaminated foods. That's one of our chief sources. Okay? 1/3 of acute cases have been, you know, traced back to contaminated food or drink. So we're ingesting either microbes or we're ingesting microbial toxins, intoxication. So when you sit back and you look at the numbers, 48 million people in the US every year are going to get sick due to foodborne illness. Okay? 3,000 of those will die. Okay? The majority of them, yes, it's going to be diarrhea, upset stomach, may or may not need a antibiotic. Pretty much tell them just go home, it'll pass. Make sure to drink lots of fluids. Hey, maybe even drink a couple of sports drinks to get those, everything back to where it needs to be. Of those that die, we have been able to trace it to certain microbes. Certain microbes have the highest kill rates. E. coli 0157H7. This is one that causes a bloody diarrhea. Somewhere along the way, strain of E. coli was able to obtain the Shigella toxin. Shigella toxin damages and kills the epithelial lining of your large intestine, causes that to slough off. So you literally start bleeding into your large intestine. Get enough damage done, uncontrollable bleeding, patient will go into shock. Within hours, you start to see organ failure, coma, then death. That 0157H7 are two ways, the O antigen, the H antigen, are two ways that we separate out the different strains of E. coli. Certain groups, certain H groups, certain O groups are going to be more pathogenic than others. Some are going to be less pathogenic to even non-pathogenic. So when you're reading, the textbook, some point in time when you're reading medical journals, and they start talking E. coli K1, or 0157H7, or any of the other O's and H's. Keep in mind, those are just different groupings where they grouped like with like. Certain groups are going to be more virulent than others.